Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. For years, I considered myself one of the lucky ones. My wife, Linda, and I had built what looked like a dream life, a successful business, 2 bright kids, and a solid marriage that people around us envied. But looking back now, I realize how illusions can masquerade as reality until they're torn down by a single, unassuming moment. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the garage, sorting through some of the stuff we'd stacked there over the years. It was the sort of chore I'd kept putting off, but I had a new lawnmower on the way and needed to clear out some space. That's when I found it, an old, dusty suitcase wedged behind a box of Christmas decorations. It didn't look familiar, but maybe it was Linda's. I figured it was filled with clothes or maybe some random knickknacks she'd forgotten about. But, feeling a strange tug of curiosity, I opened it. The moment I unzipped the case, something felt off. Inside were souvenirs, postcards, and ticket stubs from places I'd never heard her mention before. An Eiffel Tower keychain, a coaster from a bar in Miami, even a tiny snow globe from some lakeside town up north. As I examined each item, a knot formed in my stomach. Linda had never mentioned visiting these places. She traveled occasionally for work, yes, but those were quick, dull business trips with her colleagues. Or so I thought. Still, I tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Maybe these were just gifts she'd bought for the kids and forgot to give them. But the more I looked, the harder it was to ignore a growing suspicion. After a long stare at the odd collection, I told myself I was overthinking it and put the suitcase back where I'd found it. Yet as the day wore on, a nagging thought kept returning, like a toothache I couldn't ignore. A few days later, I couldn't resist any longer. I knew I shouldn't snoop. I'd always believed trust was the bedrock of our relationship, and I'd never once questioned Linda's loyalty. But that little voice in the back of my mind wouldn't stop asking, what if? So, against my better judgment, I waited until she was in the shower one evening and picked up her phone. Her phone was locked, of course, but I knew her passcode. It was our wedding anniversary. As I scanned through her messages, most of them were the usual, mundane exchanges with friends and family. I was almost ready to write it off as paranoia until I found a thread under a contact name that only showed up as a single letter, D. The messages were subtle at first, just a few lines about meeting up, some inside jokes, and light banter. But as I scrolled further, my heart sank. The messages became more intimate, layered with flirtation and innuendo that left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't some harmless friendship, it was an affair. And the worst part? It had been going on for months, possibly longer. Reading those messages, I felt like my world was collapsing in on itself. Every memory, every shared moment felt tainted. My mind started racing back to every business trip, every evening she'd stayed out late with friends. How many times had she lied to my face? How long had I been the clueless husband, blissfully unaware while my wife carried on a double life? I could have confronted her then and there, stormed into the bathroom, demanded an explanation, and maybe even thrown a few things in my anger. But I didn't. Instead, I closed her phone and put it back on her nightstand, making sure everything was exactly as it had been. I couldn't think clearly. The anger was there, boiling under the surface, but something told me to hold back, to plan, to make sure I had every piece of the puzzle before I acted. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own home. While she thought I was just going through our normal routines, I was quietly collecting evidence. I began monitoring her phone, tracking her location, and even looking through her bank statements. Each discovery only added fuel to the fire. She wasn't just seeing this guy occasionally, she was spending money on him, staying in hotels, and, from what I gathered, bringing him into our lives under the guise of work. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Every time I looked at her, I felt disgusted, betrayed, like I was staring at a stranger wearing my wife's face. But I kept up the act, smiling at our kids, joking at family dinners, and playing the part of the clueless, loving husband. I didn't know how much longer I could keep it up, but I wasn't ready to let her see the cracks in my facade just yet. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on our relationship, wondering how I'd missed the signs. Maybe I'd been too focused on my career, or maybe I'd just been too trusting. Either way, I couldn't deny that a part of me felt responsible. But every time I thought about confronting her, I'd feel that same cold fury welling up inside me, telling me to wait, to be patient, and to make sure that when I finally did confront her, it would be on my terms. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I finally decided it was time. I'd spent weeks gathering everything I needed, screenshots, receipts, even a few incriminating photos I'd pulled from her phone. I was done playing the fool. I was ready to confront her and make her understand just how deeply she'd betrayed me. But I wasn't going to just let her walk away unscathed. She'd wanted a double life. Fine. I'd show her just how costly that would be. The moment was here. I'd rehearsed it over and over in my mind, planning every detail of how I would reveal what I knew and watch the realization dawn on her face. I'd imagined her stammering, trying to explain, her lies crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. But as I sat in the quiet of the living room, waiting for her to come home, a knot of nerves tightened in my stomach. The rage and betrayal were still there, but now they were mingled with a strange, hollow sadness. Linda had left earlier in the evening for what she claimed was a work dinner. I'd let her go, acting as if nothing was amiss, even helping her pick an outfit. She'd put on a dress I'd always loved, a sleek black number that hugged her in all the right places. Seeing her wear it, knowing she was dressing up for someone else, had nearly made me snap. But I forced a smile and let her walk out the door. This was her last night as my wife in anything but name. When she finally walked through the door just after midnight, her face was flushed, and she looked surprised to see me waiting up. "Mike?" she asked, closing the door behind her and slipping off her shoes. "You're still up?" I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "Yeah, I thought we could talk for a bit." A flicker of confusion crossed her face. I could see her mind racing, wondering if she'd done something suspicious. "Sure," she replied, though I noticed a slight hesitation in her voice as she settled onto the couch opposite me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I simply looked at her, taking in every detail of her face, every sign of the life we'd built together and the years we'd spent side by side. I felt a pang of loss, but I shoved it down, knowing that the woman in front of me wasn't who I thought she was. "Where were you tonight, Linda?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction, giving me a small smile. "I told you, I had a work dinner. You know, networking and all that. Long day." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, then leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "It's funny," I said, keeping my gaze steady. "I've noticed you've had a lot of work dinners lately. And a lot of late nights." She shifted in her seat, her face tightening just a fraction. "Well, yeah, work's been pretty busy," she said, her voice defensive. "I thought you knew that." I looked her in the eye and decided it was time to drop the pretense. "Linda, I know you're lying." Her face went pale. I could almost see the gears turning in her head, scrambling to find an excuse or explanation. But I wasn't going to give her the chance. "I know about Dan," I said, my voice cold. "I know about the dinners, the hotels, the money. I know you've been lying to me for months, maybe longer." For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to form words. Then, she tried a different tactic, her face hardening. "You went through my stuff," she accused, her voice dripping with anger. "How dare you?" "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't try to turn this on me. You're the one who lied, who snuck around behind my back. I trusted you, Linda. I thought we had something real, and you threw it all away." The anger drained from her face, replaced by something else, fear, maybe, or regret. She looked down, twisting her hands in her lap, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "I'm sorry, Mike," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for you to find out like this. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice filled with bitterness. "You've been lying to me for months, seeing another man, spending our money on him, and you call that a mistake?" She looked away, her cheeks flushed with shame. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could keep it separate, that it wouldn't affect us." I laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "You thought you could keep it separate? You thought betraying me wouldn't affect us? Do you even hear yourself, Linda? This wasn't some harmless fling. You lied to me, to our kids. You turned our whole life into a joke." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, as if to touch my hand. I pulled away, not willing to let her try and soften me with a show of remorse. I didn't know if her tears were real or just another act, but either way, they weren't going to sway me. "Please, Mike," she said, her voice choked. "I know I messed up, but we can work through this. I love you. I do. I never wanted to hurt you." I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of detachment wash over me. "If you loved me, Linda, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied, snuck around, made a fool out of me." The silence hung heavy between us. I could see she was desperate, struggling to find the words to convince me to forgive her, to go back to the way things were. But there was no going back. Not after this. Finally, I took a deep breath, the decision I'd been holding inside now clear and undeniable. "We're done, Linda. I can't trust you anymore. And without trust, there's nothing left between us." Her face crumpled, and she let out a sob, her shoulders shaking. "Please, Mike, don't say that. Think about the kids, about everything we've built together. We can fix this. I'll end things with Dan. I'll do whatever you want." But her words felt hollow, like a script she'd rehearsed to try and salvage what she'd destroyed. I knew that even if she ended things with Dan, the betrayal would linger, poisoning whatever was left of our marriage. "I already have thought about the kids," I replied, my voice steady. "They deserve better than parents who lie and betray each other. I'm going to make sure they're taken care of. But as for us, there's no fixing this." She slumped back, defeated, her tears flowing freely. "What are you going to do?" I stared at her for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost pressing down on me. "I'm filing for divorce," I said quietly. "You'll hear from my lawyer soon." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head, as if trying to deny the reality in front of her. But there was no escaping it. I'd made my choice, and there was no turning back. Without another word, I stood and left the room, leaving her alone with her guilt and her tears. As I walked away, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The life I'd known was gone, shattered beyond repair. But maybe, just maybe, there was freedom in the ruins. The house felt different in the days that followed, quieter, colder. Linda had moved into the guest room, as if we were two strangers cohabiting a space neither of us wanted to be in. I knew that breaking the news to the kids was inevitable, but I was still working up the courage to have that conversation. Every time I saw their faces, a fresh wave of guilt and anger washed over me. They were innocent, and now their world was about to be torn apart because of a decision their mother made. I went through the motions, pretending that life was normal even though everything felt like it was crumbling. I kept things steady for the kids' sake, but each time I glanced at Linda, I saw only the hollow shell of the woman I once knew. She tried to act like she was sorry, occasionally bringing up therapy or counseling. I wasn't interested. There was no healing this wound, no way to rebuild the trust she'd obliterated. Every attempt she made to talk to me ended in silence or a cold, short reply. My patience for her had long since run dry. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, sifting through our photo albums. I flipped through the years captured in glossy prints, holidays, birthdays, vacations by the lake. Smiles that felt genuine back then, now tainted by the knowledge of how it all would unravel. I wanted to tear those photos apart, rip away every memory, every illusion of happiness we'd once shared. But instead, I just sat there, numb, wondering how I could have been so blind to the cracks in our life. The next morning, I decided it was time to tell the kids. They needed to hear it from me, not through overheard arguments or half-truths. I took them out for breakfast, picking a quiet diner where we could sit undisturbed. They sensed something was wrong, casting nervous glances at each other as we waited for our food to arrive. "Dad," my son finally asked, breaking the silence. "Is something going on? You've been acting different." I looked at him, and then at his sister, who was staring at me with wide, worried eyes. My chest felt tight, but I knew I couldn't delay it any longer. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "There's something I need to tell you both," I began, my voice low but steady. "Your mom and we're not going to be together anymore. We're getting a divorce." Their reactions were immediate and heart-wrenching. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, and my son's face turned red with anger and confusion. Questions poured out: why, how, what had happened to the family they thought was solid and safe. I did my best to answer, giving them the sanitized version of events. I told them that sometimes people grow apart, that we both loved them very much, and that none of this was their fault. But even as I spoke, I could see the betrayal in their eyes. They didn't understand how everything could change so suddenly. I couldn't tell them about their mother's affair, they were too young to carry that burden. But one day, they would understand, and maybe they'd even forgive me for not telling them the whole truth now. When we got home, Linda was waiting. She knew I'd taken them out to break the news, and the moment they walked through the door, she tried to hug them, to console them, but they pushed her away, retreating to their rooms without a word. She looked at me, her eyes filled with anger and desperation, and I knew she was blaming me for their reactions. But I didn't care. She'd made her bed, and now she'd have to lie in it. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and awkward, tense encounters in the house. Linda's pleas for reconciliation faded as it became clear I was set on the divorce. At one point, she even threatened to fight for custody, claiming that I was poisoning the kids against her. But I had more evidence than she could ever counter. If she wanted to fight, I was more than ready. One evening, as I was going over some of the financial statements with my lawyer, something caught my eye: a suspicious transfer from our joint account to an unfamiliar bank. It was a substantial amount, one I hadn't noticed before. I mentioned it to my lawyer, and he agreed to investigate further. If Linda thought she could siphon money away without me noticing, she was gravely mistaken. A few days later, my lawyer confirmed my suspicions. Linda had been moving money out of our joint accounts for months, hiding it away in a private account. The betrayal ran even deeper than I'd thought. I was livid, but part of me wasn't even surprised anymore. She had lied about everything else, of course she'd lie about the money too. That night, after the kids were asleep, I confronted her. "I know about the money," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but cold as steel. "You've been draining our accounts, trying to keep something for yourself while I'm left to pick up the pieces." Her face went pale, and she stumbled over her words, trying to explain, to justify it. I didn't know what was going to happen, Mike. I thought maybe. You thought you'd leave me high and dry." I interrupted, the fury boiling just below the surface. "You've already taken everything else from me, Linda. Did you really think I'd let you take the money too?" Her eyes filled with tears again, but I was long past feeling sympathy. I'd reached my limit, and she knew it. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing alone in the dark. The divorce proceedings continued, and with each passing day, Linda's attempts to paint herself as the victim grew more desperate. She tried to bring up every little fault I'd ever had, every disagreement, every moment of imperfection. But the truth was on my side, and I had all the evidence I needed to protect myself and the kids. When she realized her strategy wasn't working, she finally agreed to settle. In the end, I kept the house, full custody of the kids, and the majority of our assets. She was left with what she'd managed to squirrel away, along with the knowledge that her life, her family, and her reputation were in shambles. It wasn't the revenge I'd imagined, but it was enough. As she packed her bags and prepared to leave, she looked at me one last time. "Mike," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to end like this." I stared at her, my heart a mix of emotions, anger, sorrow, relief. But in the end, I simply nodded, unwilling to give her any more of myself. "Goodbye, Linda." And just like that, she was gone. The silence that filled the house after she left was both liberating and haunting. For the first time in years, I was free. But the cost had been high, and I knew that rebuilding my life would be a slow and painful process. Still, as I stood alone in the quiet of our home, I felt a sense of peace beginning to settle in, like a new dawn breaking over the ruins of the life I once knew. With Linda gone, life took on a new rhythm. The house was quieter, the kids and I learning to navigate our new reality without her. It was strange, really, how quickly you can adapt to the absence of someone who once seemed so essential to your life. Each day, I grew more confident that I'd made the right choice, and each night, as I lay in bed alone, I'd remind myself that, for all the sadness, I was free of her lies. The kids had adjusted better than I'd expected, but it hadn't been easy. They were still confused, angry at both of us, and the questions came in waves. Why? When? How could she do this to us? I'd give them the best answers I could, but I never told them the full truth. Some things were best left buried, like the cold embers of a fire I didn't want to rekindle. One evening, a few months after Linda had left, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was familiar, though it took me a moment to recognize it. It was Dan. My stomach turned, a fresh wave of anger rising as I wondered what he could possibly want. "Mike," he said, his voice strained, I don't know how to tell you this, but it's about Linda." "What about her?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. There was a long pause, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. She's gone, Mike. I thought you should know." I felt a strange numbness settle over me, as if I'd been plunged into icy water. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" He let out a shaky breath. She passed away. It was sudden, unexpected. An accident." He paused, and I could almost feel his discomfort through the phone. "I know things were rough between us, but I thought you deserved to know." I sat in silence, gripping the phone as his words sank in. Linda was dead. Despite everything, the betrayal, the lies, the bitterness, there was a hole in my heart that only her memory could fill, and it had just been ripped open. The woman I'd loved, the mother of my children, was gone forever. And as much as I wanted to hate her, all I could feel in that moment was an overwhelming sorrow. After a few more words, I ended the call, and for a long time, I sat in the dark, numb and silent. I thought about calling the kids into the living room, sitting them down, and telling them what had happened. But I couldn't bring myself to do it just yet. Instead, I walked to my room, closed the door, and let the emotions wash over me in waves: grief, anger, regret, and something else I couldn't quite name. In the days that followed, I did my best to explain to the kids. We attended a small memorial for her, and I tried to hold it together as they cried, their faces a painful reminder of what we'd lost. I was quiet, detached, watching as memories of her flickered through my mind, tainted by betrayal but softened by the finality of her absence. Life moved on, but something in me felt incomplete. I buried myself in work, in taking care of the kids, trying to fill the emptiness. But each night, as I lay in bed, the silence became unbearable. I'd think about the life we'd shared, the laughter, the dreams, and I'd wonder if there was something I could have done differently. Maybe I'd pushed her away. Maybe I hadn't been enough. Those doubts lingered like ghosts, haunting me in the quiet hours. Months later, while going through some of her old things, I stumbled across a letter in one of her drawers. It was addressed to me, the envelope worn and creased, as if it had been opened and closed many times. My hands shook as I opened it, the faint scent of her perfume lingering on the paper. "Mike," the letter began, in her familiar handwriting, "if you're reading this, it means I wasn't brave enough to tell you the truth while I was still here. I know you hate me, and maybe you have every reason to, but please try to understand." She went on to explain how she'd felt lost, trapped in a life she thought was perfect but didn't quite feel real. She wrote about feeling lonely, about how she'd struggled with the weight of expectations, with the fear that she'd never be enough for me or for the kids. She confessed her affair, acknowledging the hurt she'd caused, but there was a raw vulnerability in her words, a pain I'd never fully grasped. "I'm so sorry, Mike," she wrote. "For everything. I never wanted to hurt you, but I didn't know how to be the person you needed me to be. I know I can't fix what I broke, but I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me." As I finished reading, the letter slipped from my hands, and I felt a weight settle over me. I had spent so much time hating her, resenting her, trying to erase her from my life, but here in my hands was a glimpse of the woman I'd once loved, a woman who was flawed, broken, and, in her own way, just as lost as I was. In that moment, the anger I'd held onto for so long melted away, leaving only a deep, aching sadness. I wished, more than anything, that we could have found a way to bridge the distance between us. That I'd seen her pain sooner, that she'd trusted me enough to share it. But it was too late now. All I had left were memories and regrets. That night, I sat alone in the quiet house, feeling the weight of her absence in a way I hadn't before. The bitterness, the revenge, all of it seemed so hollow now. I'd gotten what I thought I wanted, but it hadn't brought the closure I'd hoped for. Instead, I was left with a hole in my heart that nothing could fill. In the weeks that followed, I tried to let go of the resentment, to remember the good times we'd shared and to forgive her for the mistakes she'd made. I told the kids stories of the mother they remembered, the loving, caring woman they'd known before everything went wrong. And little by little, the wound began to heal, though it would never fully close. One night, as I tucked the kids into bed, my daughter looked up at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "Do you think Mom loved us, Dad?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. I swallowed, feeling the familiar ache in my chest, and forced a smile. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "She loved us. She loved you both more than anything." And as I sat there, holding my daughter's hand, I realized that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. It wouldn't bring her back, it wouldn't change the past, but it was something to hold on to, a small, fragile thread of love that bound us together, even in the face of loss. And for the first time since she left, I felt a glimmer of peace.